Hi, this is Siraj Khan, lecturer in English, Cohort University of Science and Technology. Today we are talking about Biographia Literaria by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. S.T Coleridge was an English poet, literary critic, philosopher, and theologian who, with his friend William Wordsworth, was the founder of Romantic movement in England and a member of the Lake Poets. He also shared volumes and collaborated with Charles Lamb, Robert Southey, and Charles Slade. He wrote the poems The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Kubla Khan. These were the two poems that made Coleridge one of the finest writers of the Romantic era, as well as the major prose work like Biographia Literaria, which is the actual topic of today's lecture. His critical work, especially on William Shakespeare, was highly influential, and he helped introduce German idealist philosophy to English speaking culture. A German philosopher, he was very much inspired from Immanuel Kant. He inspired him, and most of the time, like, this is what the turning point was, that S.T Coleridge took philosophy related to poetry. Biographia Literaria was a work by S.T Coleridge, which is one of the most important and significant theoretical works. Consists 24 chapters, and which was published in 1815 and 17. And actually this work was published after 2 years of its writing, when he wrote Biographia Literaria, as this was the nature of S.T. Coleridge, that he was very much inconsistent. And this weakness of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, that there was no consistency in his work, as he left almost every work of written by him incomplete. Anyway, this Biographia Literaria concerned with the form of poetry, the genius of the poet, and relationship to philosophy. This is for the first time he brought philosophy, as he was inspired from German philosopher, into literature. Coleridge's whole aesthetic, his definition of poetry, his idea of the poet, and his poetical criticism revolve around his theory of creative imagination, as his imagination and fancy, the theory which is Biographia Literaria. In full, Biographia Literaria are biographical sketches of my literary life and opinions, is an autobiography actually in discourse by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which he published in 1817 in 2 volumes of 23 or 24 chapters. His views on is when he met William Wordsworth in 1795, and Dorothy was the sister of Wordsworth, was very much influenced by his thoughts and knowledge. As William S.T. Coleridge believed that poetry must have effects on heart, mind, and soul. Though, he took opium to get stable in life, like, this was his opinion, that when you are taking opium, it gives you knowledge, and it gives you time to think. It increases your ability, as William Wordsworth says that S.T. Coleridge was the most wonderful man I ever met, and he was the supporter of Ralph Waldo Emerson's theory in American literature, transcendentalism. As in chapter 4, Coleridge outlines his poetic creed, all the major issues be discussed here in relating to the origins of lyrical ballads. Coleridge in his chapter implies the mimetic approach since he delineates the two distinct subject matters and incidents which he and Wordsworth were to imitate. Coleridge says that the power of poetry is twofolded. It can arouse reader sympathy, faithful adherence to the truth of nature, and by giving the interest of novelty, by the modifying colors of imaginations. The first thing that is, it arises sympathy. In sympathy that must be with faithful adherence to truth of nature, in the interest of novelty that must be new. Two conditions of poetry: the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature, and the power of giving the interest of novelty by modifying with the colors of imaginations. Coleridge, poetry of the highest kind may exist without meter and even without the contradistinguishing object of poem. He gives example of writing like Plato, Jeremy, Taylor, and Bible, for it is a distinction resulting from the poetic genius itself, which sustains and modifies the images, the thought and emotions of the poet's own mind. From 1791 until 1794, Coleridge attended Jesus College, and Coleridge's poems should be directed to persons and characters supernatural or at least romantic, but would be presented with such a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. Wordsworth would take an opposing approach. His subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life, but he would give them the charm of novelty so that they would excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural. William Wordsworth's theory of the treatment and the subject matter should be, to quote Coleridge, like the sudden charm which accident of light and shade, which moonlight or sun should diffuse over a known and familiar landscape, appeared to represent the practicability of combining both. These are of poetry of nature. In this most memorable of all critical phrases, to produce the willing suspension of disbelief in the reader for the moment which constitutes poetic faith, Coleridge moves into the affective domain. In essence, he contends that a reader picks up every literary work knowing it is fiction, that is, disbelieving that it is reality, but the reader willingly suspends this belief while reading in order to gain the pleasure which the literary work promises. This suspension of disbelief is the poetic faith which every reader must accord an author until the author through the work violates this faith, that everyone, whatever the writer writes, that must be true. Coleridge then gives his definition of a poem. This definition first uses the affective theory. A poem seeks to produce immediate pleasure in the reader, not to teach a truth. Now, poetry is not for the purpose of teaching, but it gives pleasure, the immediate effect. And all of the critics, this assertion runs counter to all of the critics we have read since Horace, including Wordsworth. The second part of the definition uses the objective theory. A poem has organic unity, that all the parts, once you remove one part, it must be incomplete, that all the parts of poetry, meter, rhythm, tone, syllables, all are in one organic whole. A poem is that species of composition which is opposed to works of science by proposing for its immediate object pleasure, not truth. Such a legitimate poem must be one the parts of which mutually support and explain each other. all in their proportion, harmonizing with and supporting the purpose and known influences of metrical arrangement objective. To Coleridge, the essence of poetry is not found in the objective or affective approaches, rather, it is found in what goes on in the mind of the poet, the expressive approach. His ideas based on expressive approach. Thus, Coleridge states what is poetry is so nearly the same question with what is a poet, that the answer to the one is involved in the solution to the other. To Coleridge, the true poet is characterized by poetic genius that he later calls poetic imagination. Coleridge then describes what goes on in the poet's mind when a poem is being created. Imagination, he says, sustains and modifies the images, thoughts, and emotions of the poet's own mind. The poet, described in ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity. It diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and, as it were, fuses each into each. Imagination reveals itself in the balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities of sameness with difference of the general with the concrete, the idea with the image, the individual with the representative, the sense of novelty and of freshness with old and familiar objects. And while it blends and harmonizes the natural and the artificial, still subordinates art to nature. Imagination is the soul that is everywhere and in each, and forms all into one graceful and intelligent whole. For poetry, imagination is the supreme object. It is the soul of each intelligent work. Fancy and imagination, says theory, builds his theory on the basic distinction between fancy and imagination, terms which were used before him more or less indistinguishably to express the same import. Coleridge imaginations, primary imaginations and secondary imaginations, creativity, primary imaginations, originality, used unconsciously, human individual power to produce images, power to give chaos a certain order. Secondary poetic faculty, which not only gives shape and order to a given word, but builds. That is the secondary imaginations of the poets that creates a different world based on his imaginations, and primary imaginations, his creativity, originality, and unconscious behavior. A kind of fancy is a kind of logical faculty, that the mechanical ability the poet has to use devices like figures of speeches. He uses similes, metaphors, personifications, alliterations to blend various ingredients into beautiful images. Types is primary imaginations and secondary imaginations. Fancy and imaginations. Coleridge ultimately uses the term fancy for the 18th century view of imagination, which was essentially mechanical and determined by the law of association. Imagination on this view does not modify, much less does it transform the materials that it deals with, but merely reproduce them. Fancy, says Coleridge, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definities. Fancy must receive all its materials ready-made from the law of association. We associate things through our fancies. Our brief discussion of the theory of association in the context of the 18th century view of imagination would make clear that although Coleridge does assign a main role to fancy in the production of poetry. Good luck and thank you.